a bruise on her arm, a name he never knew, and a letter that demands justice. A quiet rancher, who lost everything, wakes to find a frightened girl on his porcher sleeve stained, her eyes hollow, her birth certificate bearing his name, and a warning that someone is hunting her. In the desert's hush, what begins as a whispered promise will roar into a reckoning that shakes Crossbone to its core. Emory Gable rose before dawn, as he had every morning for the past 10 years, and lit the lantern in the kitchen. Its pale glow revealed a tabletop of neatly lined knives, a stack of tin plates, and a single photograph propped against the wall. His wife, smiling in a white dress stained with prairie dust, and the faint outline of a child no one ever met. He poured coffee into a chipped mug, listening to the hiss of steam as though it carried voices he could almost but not quite hear. Outside, the ranch lay in silence. A low ridge cradled the barnyard, and beyond it, the land flattened into scorched grass and jagged rocks. Emory moved with deliberate care, his boots stirring a thin layer of sand that drifted through the air like memory. Each step was familiar. The same loose board by the stable door that creaked in protest, the same hoofprints leading to the water trough where he washed down the morning's feed. Even the cattle seemed to wait for him, their heads bowed in peaceful routine. He checked the fences, inspecting each post as though it bore a secret. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of mending broken things, traced the grain of the weathered wood. There was comfort in the unchanging chores feeding, watering, repairing chores that required no conversation, no questions. The ranch had been his refuge after the fire took Sarah and the baby, a place where the wind could howl but his heart remained a silent, unmoving stone. By mid-morning, Emory was back at the kitchen table, carving a hunk of stale bread into thick slices. He took his meals alone, sitting straight-backed in a chair that looked as though it might splinter under the weight of unspoken sorrow. He ate methodically, bread, a slab of salted meat, and black coffee that burned his throat. He had given up trying to taste anything beyond the bitterness he carried within. He glanced at the window, watching the horizon for any shiftan unfamiliar dust trail, a distant rider which rarely came. His gaze drifted back to the photograph. Once, when grief had threatened to drown him, he thought about leaving, tracing routes on old maps and dreaming of a town that would remember him not as a widower but as a man with a future. But each dawn found him here, bound by memories heavy as stones, unwilling or unable to move. As the sun climbed, the air grew hot and still, and Emory closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence settle over him. It was a stillness he knew intimately, one that had kept him safe from the noise of the world and from the ache in his own chest. Yet somewhere beyond that quiet, something was coming. Something that would not be satisfied with routine or solitude. Something that demanded he break the silence he had guarded so fiercely. Late afternoon suns slanted across the scrubland, turning the horizon to waves of copper and rust. Emory paused at the edge of his field, hammer in hand, listening to the rumble of an engine far off the dirt road. Dust curled skyward in a thin, trembling plume, and he wiped sweat from his brow before setting down his tools. The sound was wrong too clumsy, too heavy for any neighbor's wagon. He walked toward the road with measured steps, spine straight against the heat's pressure. When the pickup appeared, its once white paint was caked in ochre mud and iron-red clay, and the tires churned soft soil like hungry jaws. The driver's side window cracked open, releasing a faint smell of wet leather and engine oil. No one sat behind the wheel. Emory called, his voice crisp against the stillness. "Hello?" A girl emerged from the bed of the trucker boots, unsteady on the rough metal. She moved with wary grace, as though every surface might cut her. She wore a faded calico dress that hung limp, its hem fraying, and carried a single satchel that looked as worn as she was. Her long sleeves linen so thin they might as well have been paper-covered arms too slender for her 14 years. She paused a few paces from him, eyes dark and unblinking, taking in the ranch house, a low, whitewashed building with windows that caught the dying light. Emory offered one hand, thumb hooked over a broken fence post. "You lost?" he asked softly. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached inside her pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. The page fluttered in the breeze like a wounded bird's wing. Emory lifted it, studying the neat script that read, "She's yours now. Don't let her disappear too." His jaw clenched. He scanned the edge of the document for a return address. None. She took a cautious step forward, and Emory noticed her gaze shift to his chest where the keys to the barn hung on a nail. When she looked back, he saw the first flicker of something deeper. Fear. He couldn't place the exact moment, but all at once he felt the familiar draw of responsibility, sharper than any memory of loss. He pointed toward the porch. "Come on, let's get you inside." She hesitated, then climbed the 3 steps one at a time, skirt brushing the wood. The screen door slammed behind her, and the echo lingered longer than it should in the empty afternoon air. Emory watched her from the threshold, the paper clenched in his fist, the weight of her presence shifting the dust around his boots. For the first time in years, he sensed the quiet had fractured. And when he reached to shut the door against the settling dusk, he found himself unwilling to seal it completely. That evening, Emory paused outside the small bedroom at the far end of the hall. Years ago, it had been painted a soft yellow, its walls scuffed by a crib and a rocking chair he and Sarah once shared while their son slept. Dust lay thick on the windowsill, motes swirling in the lantern's beam like half-forgotten dreams. He hesitated, hand on the doorknob, as though the room itself might speak of loss he still could not bear. Inside, the closet door sagged on its hinges, and an old coat rack leaned against the wall, a relic from Sarah's plans to host Sunday visitors. Emory fetched a broom and started at the far corner, sweeping decades of neglect into a ragged line of dirt and dried grass. He moved with deliberate care, remembering how Sarah once braided a ribbon through the spindles of the crib's headboard. When the mattress came up squealing, he half expected the floorboards to crack beneath his weight, but they held firm just as the ranch did, through drought and flood and the fire that stole half his heart. Delilah hovered in the doorway, her form backlit by the fading glow in the hall. She clutched her satchel close, sleeves drawn tight, eyes measuring every corner of the room. When Emory glanced at her, she offered nothing but a small, reluctant nod. He set the broom aside and lifted the mattress, revealing a scattering of nails and a single yellowed newspaper clipping an old land sale notice for Gable's ranch. He tucked it away, knowing it was too fragile for reuse but too meaningful to discard. He pulled the ragged curtains open, and a sliver of moonlight spilled across the floorboards, illuminating peeling paint and the faint outline of the crib's shadow. Delilah stepped forward, fingers brushing the rails. Her movement was precise, wary, as though she might expect the wood to spit back at her. Emory found a clean sheet in the linen closet, its embroidery faded but intact, and laid it across the mattress. He smoothed wrinkles with slow strokes, offering a small grace in a world that had given her none. When he placed a kerosene lamp on the bedside table, the glow settled warmly against the pale walls. Delilah watched its flame flicker, and for the first time that day, her shoulders relaxed just enough for him to see the tremor in her breath. Emory retrieved a worn quilt from a high shelf Sarah's handiwork, embroidered with wildflowers in blues and gold sand, draped it over the foot of the bed. He paused, hand resting on the soft wool, recalling Sarah's laughter when she chose the pattern. Delilah's voice emerged then, soft and uncertain. "Thank you." It wasn't a confession, nor a plea. It was something steadier, a new word in a language she was just beginning to learn. Emory nodded, careful to keep his own voice even. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll start fresh in the morning." Outside, the night settled back into silence, but within those 4 walls, something shifted. The room wasn't ready for all of them, but neither was he any more content to let the past define their days. As Emory closed the door, he left it cracked just a hair, offering Delilah space to breathe and him a promise that no matter the darkness they faced, she would never face it alone. By late afternoon, the heat off the sun-baked earth tapered into a dry warmth, and Emory found Delilah sitting on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest. She watched the cattle amble home, their slow-moving shadows stretching across cracked ground. He offered her a drink of water in a tin cup, but she shook her head, tucked her sleeves tighter, and stared at the horizon as if it might swallow her whole. He left her there and headed to the barn to check the saddles, each strap oiled and ready for a horse that hadn't carried him anywhere beyond the fence line in years. He hung the leather carefully, then turned back toward the house, pausing when Delilah rose and followed at a distance. She hovered behind him in the barn's dim light, posture rigid, as though the rafters could rain splinters at any moment. Outside again, Emory fetched a pail and moved to the watering trough. Water spat over the rim, cool and clear, and he dipped a hand in to rinse off the day's dust before scooping it into the trough. Delilah stepped forward and, hesitating, lifted the pail to pour. The water splashed her boots, and she flinched, almost reflexively drawing back as if startled by her own reflection. He caught the pail before it slipped and set it aside, tilting his head. "Easy," he said, voice soft like the wind over bare earth. "It's just water." She met his eyes then, long enough for him to see the wariness tangled beneath her fatigue. She nodded once, as if reassured by the truth in his words, and moved to the fence to scratch at the wood with her boot. He watched her for a moment, then returned to the corral to fetch hay for the night. When dusk arrived, Delilah stayed inside while Emory fed the horses grain from a burlap sack. He could feel her gaze through the open stall doors, quiet but persistent. After the last horse nickered into the darkness, he draped the sack over a fence post and walked back to the porch. Delilah waited there, the lantern's glow outlining her slender frame. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. She glanced up at him, expression guarded. "Okay." Not the truth he'd hoped for, but a start. He nodded, drawing in a long breath of the cool evening air, scented with sagebrush and distant pine. Cricket song rose in the dark, steady and small. In the dim light, he saw Delilah's sleeves roll down to her wrists, the fabric folded just so. He wondered what she tried to hide each time she passed a mirror. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll check the fences, mend the gates." He paused, choosing his next words. "And if you want, you can help me milk the goats." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, considering. "Maybe." He offered a faint smile, the first since her arrival. No rush. As the night deepened, Emory sat with her on the porch until the lantern guttered low. They watched the stars prick the sky, each silent, each waiting for something that neither yet named. But in that shared quiet, a small bridge was built stone plank at a time across the expanse of their separate solitude. Morning light sifted through the slats of the chicken coop, turning dust motes into drifting embers. Emory paused at the threshold, his calloused hand on the worn wood, and watched Delilah gather eggs. She moved with careful precision, as if each shell might splinter beneath her fingertips. The hens clucked around her, pecking at stray grain, their restless red combs gleaming in the pale glow. He stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind him. Delilah lifted her arm to place a brown egg in her basket, and for the first time Emory saw it, a bruise the color of bruised plums, half hidden by the thin fabric of her sleeve. It curved around her forearm, dark and swollen, the skin stretched tight. His chest tightened, and he swallowed against the knot of anger and fear rising in his throat. "She must have bumped it on the roost," Delilah said, voice low, too calm. She dropped her sleeve with a practiced hand, as though she'd done it 100 times, revealed the mark, then erased its memory. "Coop's tight in here." Emory met her gaze, gray eyes steady. "You sure?" She nodded, keeping her eyes downcast, and reached for another egg. The basket tipped, and 2 eggs cracked on the straw. She knelt, gathering the fragments, careful to hide the bruise from view. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. "Just clumsy." He crouched beside her, setting his basket down. Gently he touched her elbow, his finger brushing the swollen skin. She flinched, a small hitch of breath that made his hand hover inches from her arm. He withdrew it and swallowed again. "Let's get you some water," he said. Outside, He led her to the trough and handed her the tin cup. She drank in quick sips, lashes brushing her cheeks, and he studied the line of her throat, the tense coil of her shoulders. He remembered his wife's gentleness, the way Sarah soothed, scrape, and cut without fuss. He wanted to do the same for Delilah, but these bruises were deeper etched by hands that knew fear better than kindness. He set a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not making you talk," he said softly. "But if something's wrong, I need to know." She closed her eyes, the cup still at her lips. When she opened them, the hardness in her gaze had softened just enough to let him in. "I'm okay," she whispered, voice thick. "Really?" He wanted to press, to demand the truth, but the memory of her flinch stayed him. Instead, he nodded once, firm. "All right." He fetched clean cloth and cool water from the house, then returned to the coop. Kneeling before her, he moistened the cloth and pressed it gently to the bruise, careful not to hurt her. Delilah tensed, but did not pull away. The coolness eased the swelling, and he held the cloth in place until the color began to fade. When he finally stood, he tucked the damp cloth into his pocket. "Rest for a bit," he said. "I'll bring supper to you here." She swallowed and nodded, turning back to the hens. Her shoulders were straighter now, as if she'd borrowed his strength. Emory watched her work, the bruise still visible in the waning light, and felt a fierce protectiveness ignite in his chest. He'd given her shelter and a name. Now he would guard her body and her secrets, no matter what they cost him. Dark settled over Gable's ranch with a quiet urgency, as though the land itself braced for what might slip through the shadows. Emory finished his supper in the kitchen by lantern light, each bite tasting of stale bread and concern. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He stood, cup in hand, listening for the telltale creak of Delilah's door. It came not in greeting, but in Plea's soft thump against the frame, followed by the low murmur of a child caught between dreams and panic. Emory crossed the hall and pressed an ear to the wood. The lamplight from under the door painted his boots in yellow. Inside, Delilah's voice trembled. He heard a single word, "Stop," then another, "Please." He inhaled and knocked once, softly. "Delilah?" he said, voice even, though his heart pounded like hoofbeats. "It's me," silence answered. He knocked again, more firmly this time. "I'm here. You're safe." Minutes passed. The lantern guttered as the wick burned low, and Emory's jaw clenched. He flicked the lamp to life, hefted his rifle, and eased the door open. Moonlight slanted across the room, illuminating her tossed hair, tangled in the quilt's edge. Delilah sat up, eyes wide and haunted, sweat gleaming on her brow. Emory set the rifle against the wall and crossed to the bed. He crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You dreamt again," he said softly. She nodded, voice small. He was there. She covered her face with shaking hands, words muffled. Emory drew back the quilt and lifted her sleeve. Along her forearm, bruises bloomed in purplish arc-sold and new overlapping like a crooked timeline. He pressed his palm to her skin, careful not to bruise more. "Tell me what happened," he urged. Delilah swallowed, her breath hitching. "When I sleep, he finds me." Her words were shards of glass in the still air. "He grabs my wrist. He says I belong to him." Emory's chest tightened. Memory flashed Sarah's gentle hands holding their son, safety shattered by a fire not of this world. He gripped Delilah's arm, guiding her to sit with him. "You're not alone," he said. "You don't belong to anyone." She looked at him then, pupils dilated with fear and relief. Her voice was a whisper, but every syllable carried the weight of her terror. "He waits for me, outside the fence, in my dreams." Emory lifted the lantern onto the bedside table and knelt on the floorboards. "Dreams can't hurt you," he said. "Not if you know they're not real." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small scrap of parchment, the note that had come with her. He smoothed it between them. "This came for you," he reminded her. "You're mine now. I won't let him touch you again." Delilah's tears glinted in the lantern glow. She clutched the paper, knuckles white. Emory closed his eyes for a moment, tasting the promise in the cool night air. When he opened them, his gaze was steady as the ranch door he would never let falter. "No more running," he said. "Tonight, you stay here. I'll sit guard." She nodded, folding into the pillows as the quilt rose around her like a shield. Emory settled in the chair by her door, rifle across his lap, lantern at his side. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. Inside, the night held its breath and, for once, Delilah did too, letting sleep come on the promise of protection rather than fear. Emory sat on the porch long after midnight, rifle across his knees and lantern guttering, its flame bobbing like a heartbeat. The ranch lay under a blanket of stars, so dense it felt as though the sky might press down and smother him. Crickets rattled in the tall grass beyond the fence, and the horses shifted in their stalls, uneasy in the hush. He scanned the shadows, each one a question he'd lived his life avoiding. Then he saw the shape, a tall figure standing motionless, just beyond the split-rail fence, backlit by a pale sliver of moon. The man's coat was dark as spilled ink, the brim of his hat low, hiding his face. Emory's breath caught. His finger eased to the rifle's trigger, but he didn't move. The man didn't move either, he simply watched, as though assessing whether the ranch belonged to him. Emory whispered Delilah's name into the night, and the figure shifted, as though disturbed by the sound, but did not flee. Instead, he lifted one hand and pressed it to the fence rail, as if claiming it. The weapon in Emory's hands felt suddenly too light, too impotent against the weight of that silent demand. He rose, boots creaking on the porch, and called out, voice low but firm, "Who's there?" The words hung between them, fragile in the darkness. The man's hat tipped back just enough for Emory to glimpse, pale skin stretched tight over high cheekbones, eyes that gleamed with something like triumph. Then the hat came down, and the face disappeared. Emory took a deliberate step forward. "I said, speak." His voice echoed against the empty fields. The figure stepped back a pace, then another, shadow swallowing him bit by bit until he vanished into the trees. The moonlight caught the edge of his coat as he passed, a final taunt before he disappeared. Emory exhaled, the tension in his shoulders grinding free. He scanned the tree line where the man had stood, searching for movement. None came. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the faintest whisper of sound of footfall, a breath, or maybe nothing at all. Inside the house, Delilah's door remained closed. He wanted to wake her, to tell her they weren't alone, but he knew the terror in her dreams was stronger than any warning he could voice. Instead, he returned to his chair, rifle held ready, and stared into the blackness until sleep dared him no more. When dawn's first light brushed the horizon, Emory stood by the fence, inspecting each rail as though expecting the man's handprint to remain imprinted on the wood. There was no sign, no footprints, no scuff of boot, only the cold whisper of the night's witness. Yet Emory felt the weight of that silhouette still pressing against his ribs. He knelt and ran his fingers along the rail, closing his eyes. The ranch had been safe for years, held together by routine and silence, but in that moment he understood, some dangers couldn't be fenced out. They lurked beyond the wood and wire, waiting for a crack in the quiet. And now that he'd seen one, there was no turning back. Emory found Delilah waiting at the kitchen table in the pale light of early morning, her satchel at her feet as though she'd carried it into her dreams. He set 2 cups of weak coffee before them, his own, always black, hers half sweetened with a spoonful of molasses. She cradled the warm tin cup between skinny fingers, eyes fixed on the swirling steam. Outside, the ranch yard lay ghost quiet, broken only by the soft clink of the coffee pot as he poured. Delilah didn't speak until he slid a plate of leftover cornbread toward her. She broke off a piece with trembling hands, chewed twice, then laid the crumbs on the table like clues. Finally, she looked up, the hollows beneath her eyes, deep in the morning light. "She called it a Christian ranch," she began, voice low, as if naming it might give it power. "Brother Thomas said they'd saved her soul." Her gaze drifted past Emory to the window, where the light glinted off the tin roof of the barn. But there was no prayer, only fear. Emory listened, coffee forgotten at his side. He knew grief, knew how memory could twist truth into something sharp enough to cut. He folded his hands on the table. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. She swallowed, jaw tight. "When Mama died, I had nowhere else. The state, they sent me there, said he'd take care of me." She drew a trembling line through the air with her finger. "Brother Thomas wore black boots, black coat. He said God gave him this land to save girls like me." Her lip quivered. "But he didn't save us. He hid us." Her words collided with the silence thick and awful. Emory thought of the man at the fence, the quiet menace in his stillness. He remembered the desk of the local judge, dusty and indifferent, the way laws bent for those with money and prayers. Delilah's story was more than bruises and nightmares. It was proof of men's capacity for violence in the name of faith. "He kept us working," she continued, voice steadier now that the words flowed. "Early dawn till after dark. No letters out, no one in." She traced the rim of the cup with a fingernail. "If we cried, he said we cursed the ranch. If we ran, his men found us." Emory's jaw clenched. He pushed his chair back and paced to the window, staring at the horizon. In that vast, indifferent landscape, Delilah had been a prisoner. He turned back to her, seeing for the first time how small she seemed against the hardships she'd endured. "We'll shut that place down," he said, voice low and certain. "I'll find out where it is." Delilah's shoulders eased, a breath she didn't know she'd held, finally escaping. "Thank you," she whispered. He slid into the seat beside her, placing a hand over hers on the table. "No more hiding," he promised. "Not ever again." Between them, the coffee grew cold, but something warmer took root, a shared resolve. Beyond the fields and hills, Brother Thomas's ranch awaited, and with it the chance to transform fear into justice. Emory dipped his head, tasting the dawn's promise, and prepared himself for the hard road that lay ahead. Emory sat at the kitchen table well into midday. The ragged map of the county spread before him like a promise. He traced a line from Gable's ranch to a smudge where Crossbone ended, and the hills blurred into nothing. Delilah stood by the window, watching the sun dance on the tin roof of the barn, silent but expectant. Emory folded the map and slid it into his coat, resolve tightening in his chest. He stepped onto the porch and lifted a hand to shield his eyes against the glare. The ranch lay quiet, as though waiting with him. He called for Scout, his old mare, and led her from the corral, the thud of hooves on packed earth marking each heartbeat. He saddled her without haste, slicking the leather straps and tightening the cinch with practiced fingers. Each buckle flicked a memory of younger days of tired horses and late-night rides that ended with justice served. When the horse was ready, Emory mounted and rode out, Delilah's gaze chasing him across the parched fields. He nodded once, curt and certain, then urged Scout toward town. The ride was long, the wind fierce in his face, but his mind stayed on one task: finding Sam Calder. Sam had been a marshal when Emory was just a ranch handstern of jaw, steady of aim, and unafraid to stand against Crossbone's richest men. He retired 2 years ago to a cabin near the river, fed up with politics and promises broken at courtroom doors. Emory found him by the oaks where the river bent, Sam's rifle across his lap and the water's song in his ears. "Emory Gable," Sam said without looking up, voice rich with surprise. "Thought you'd turned tail for good." Emory swung down and folded Scout's reins over the saddle. "Got a situation," he said, voice low. He outlined Delilah's arrival, the bruises, the dreams, and the man at the fence. He spoke of Brother Thomas's hidden ranch, the girls still trapped, and the town's unwillingness to listen. Sam's gray eyes narrowed as he absorbed each detail. When Emory finished, only the river broke the silence. At last, Sam rose, brushing leaves from his coat. "You know what that means?" he said. "We'll be riding into a hornet's nest." "I know." Emory's gaze was steady. "But Delilah's counting on us. I'm damned if I let her down." Sam nodded once, solid as stone. He laid a hand on Emory's shoulder. "Then let's do what the law's forgotten." They mounted, two shadows merging against the rippling water. As they rode back toward Crossbone, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold. Emory felt the weight of his vow shift from burden to purpose. With Sam Calder at his side, he would bend justice back toward the helpless and the hidden. And when dawn found them at Brother Thomas's doorstep, they would knock with rifles in hand and no mercy for those who preyed on the innocent. They rode before dawn, low clouds tacking the sky in bruised gray strips that threatened rain but delivered only damp chill. Emory and Sam followed a faint trail of wagon ruts that veered off the main road, winding through tangled mesquite until the world narrowed to scrub and silence. Every snapped twig and rustle in the brush set Delilah's ghost brother Thomas's ghost echoing in Emory's mind. At midday, the land flattened into a hollow ringed by broken fence posts. In the center stood a cluster of outbuildings, a weathered barn, a whitewashed bunkhouse, and a low windowless shed. The paint peeled like scabbed skin, and none of the structures bore a sign. But the wind carried faint sobs, carried the hollow clack of wooden shoes on dirt. They tethered their horses behind a thicket and crept forward. Through a small window in the bunkhouse, Emory spotted girls seated on narrow beds, arms crossed protectively over their chests. Their dresses were plain and their hair bound tight, faces turned away from the window as though they'd learned to vanish at the sight of strangers. A single lamp burned inside, its glow wavering like a candle in a storm. Sam whispered, "They're here." His hand rested on his holster, but he did not draw. He waited, rifle lowered but ready. Emory pressed his palm to the wood, feeling the pulse of fear on the other side. They slipped to the door and found it latched from within. Sam eased it open, stepping inside, Emory at his shoulder. The girls looked up, eyes wide, bodies stiff with fear. Their cheeks were hollow, their skin too pale under the lamplight's yellow wash. One girl, younger than the rest, had a fresh bruise on her cheek, a ripple of purple and red. She sat apart, fingers flexing like claws against her skirt. "Good morning," Sam said quietly, lowering his rifle. "We're here to help." The bunkhouse held its breath. Then the girls rose, one by one, as though released by that single promise. Their voices came in hushed chorus questions, "Please," and the names they whispered like prayer. Sally, Mary, Ellen. Emory stepped forward, kneeling to meet the youngest girl's gaze. "I'm Emory Gable," he said. "You're safe now." He lifted his hand, showing it empty. "No one's going to hurt you again." Behind him, Sam opened the shed door, revealing stacks of locked crates and bundles of rope. Emory's heart tightened, tangible evidence of cruelty, waiting to be dismantled. He strode past Sam and reached for the shackles hanging on a nail, breaking the first one with a single twist of his wrist. The ring clattered to the floor like a freed heartbeat. The girls exhaled in relief so loud it echoed against the rafters. Emory held the broken shackle aloft. "You belong to yourselves now." Outside, the wind picked up, tearing at the loose boards of the barn. Emory and Sam gathered the girls. Some wept, some stared, some simply stood, stunned. As they led them toward the horses, Emory caught the eye of the youngest. Her bruise still glowed in the dim light, but she offered him a small, fierce smile. He returned it. In that moment, the ranch of shadows began to crumble, and the sunlight broke through on trembling wings. Night fell with a brittle quiet, one that snapped against Emory's nerves like a rifle's report. After Sam and the rescued girls rode off toward Crossbone under lantern-bearing escort, Emory returned to the bunkhouse to gather what he'd burned for evidence: ledgers bound with greasy twine, letters stained with sweat and tears, and a ledger noting payments from men of influence. He stacked them in a burlap satchel and slung it over his shoulder. Outside, Delilah waited by the corral gate, the horses shifting beneath their blankets. She traced the rail with a cautious finger, as if testing whether it would hold her weight. Emory slid his rifle from the saddle crutch and checked its hammer, each click echoing in the night. In the lantern's glow, the wood's grain was polished, smooth by years of use, the hands of a man who knew how easy it was to end a life and how hard it could be to save one. He looked at Delilah, arms wrapped around her waist. The bruise on her forearm had faded to dull purple, but the line was still there, a promise in its own right. "I want you to have this," Emory said, raising the rifle so its barrel caught the lantern light. "It's my wife's. Came to me after the fire. I never used it." He held it out by the stock. Delilah's eyes widened. She reached out, fingertips brushing the cool metal. "I can't take this," she whispered. Emory shook his head. "You can. You might need it." He knelt, so they were eye level. "If he comes back, Brother Thomas, or any man who thinks he owns, you'll know I've got your back, whether I'm near or miles away." She swallowed and took the rifle, cradle holding it as though it weighed nothing at all. The stock fit in her palm like a promise made solid. "I won't drop it," she said, voice steadier than he'd heard. He rose and gathered her into a hug that felt strange and right all at once. The horses nickered and the wind stirred the mesquite, but for a heartbeat there was only warmth between them. When he let go, Delilah's cheeks were damp in the lantern light. He led her to the porch of the bunkhausenau, emptied of its horror sand, set a small trunk against the wall. "Here," he said, opening it to reveal a folded photograph of his wife, Sarah, standing in a prairie breeze, smiling. She believed in mercy, but she believed in justice more. He returned the picture to the trunk and snapped the lid shut. Delilah knelt and placed the rifle beside the trunk, then set the trunk's key into her palm as though it were a talisman. "Justice," she echoed. Her gaze met his, reflecting a new steadiness. "I'll remember." Emory stepped back, nodding. He lit a lantern he'd carried from the ranch, its warm glow spilling over them both. "When you hold that," he said, "you're holding my promise." "We're done running, Delilah. From now on we stand our ground." She rose, shoulders squared, and tucked the rifle beneath her arm as though it were part of her body. Together, father and daughter bound, by blood, by bruises, and by the promise of justice watched the night. In the distance, a coyote called, and instead of fear, they answered with silence, the quiet before dawn and the certainty that for the first time they would face it together. When Emory and Delilah rode into Crossbone at first light, the town seemed suspended between fear and curiosity. The dusty main street was lined with shuttered storefronts, the mercantile, the saloon, the law office where Judge Whitcomb dispensed justice with more patience for gold than for truth. Word of the rescue had spread faster than wildfire, carried on ragged whispers and the rumble of a half-empty wagon. Emory tethered Scout by the hitching post outside the saloon. He slid from the saddle, Delilah close at his side, the rifle swung across her back like a banner. Sam Calder waited in the shade of the jailhouse, nodding grimly as they approached. Behind him, the rescued girls huddled, eyes bright with something like hope. A crowd gathered, faces pinched with skepticism, relief, and something darker, guilt. Townsfolk edged from porches and doorways, children pressed between legs, and a handful of men in fine coats watched with folded arms. Among them, Brother Thomas stood smug in his Sunday black, flanked by two hired hands with pistols at their hips. His eyes passed over Delilah as though she were livestock returned to the wrong pen. Emory stepped forward. "Brother Thomas," he called, voice carrying over the clatter of horses and whisper of wind. "You stand accused of kidnapping, assault, and false imprisonment. These girls," he gestured toward the huddled women, "will bear witness to your crimes." Thomas smiled, thin lips curling. "This is a private matter, Gable. These were my wards, obedient girls." He flicked a glance at the judge's office, as if expecting a nod. Judge Whitcomb emerged then, wig askew, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Marshal Calder, bring forth the evidence," Whitcomb said, voice tremulous. Sam stepped forward with the burlap satchel of ledgers, letters, and receipts. He dumped its contents onto the saloon's hitching post, pages stained and faded, ink smeared by tears, bearing the names of benefactors who thought their gold bought silence. The crowd craned to read the entries. A hush fell. A boy tugged at his mother's skirt. A merchant spat into the dirt. Whitcomb lifted one ledger, scanning the handwriting, throat-bobbing as he read of payments marked for services rendered beside the names of townsmen. Thomas's smugness wavered. He reached for his gun, but Emory's rifle rose to block him. Delilah stepped forward, rifle steady in her hands. "Justice," she said, voice clear. Isn't for sale. Thomas froze, eyes flicking between Delilah and the gun barrel. Whitcomb's face reddened, and with a shaking hand, he tore off his spectacles. You'll be tried, he stammered. You'll answer. Not by you, Emory interrupted. By women you hurt, and by the law, when it's not bought by donations. He turned to Delilah. Are you ready to speak? She stepped to the forefront, bruised arm exposed, eyes unshielded for the first time. He promised to save me, she said, voice steady but fierce. But he sold my silence and my flesh to men who paid him gold. I'm not afraid anymore. Her words rippled through the crowd like a gale. As the judge called for a marshal to take Thomas into custody, the hired hands lowered their heads and dropped their pistols. The merchants shifted uncomfortably. Children exhaled, and the sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of shadowed doubt. Emory slipped an arm around Delilah's shoulders, pulling her close as Thomas was led away in irons. The town watched in stunned silence. No cheer, no jeers, only the tremor of change in the air. Delilah lifted her chin, meeting Emory's gaze. In that moment, father and daughter stood tall in the noon's glare, the quiet rancher no one remembered, and the girl who refused to disappear, rewriting Crossbone's story in the dust beneath their boots. The following morning, Crossbone awoke as though nothing had changed. The clink of coffee cups at Millie's diner, the scuff of boots on boardwalk, the lazy spin of the windmill over the saloon. But beneath the surface, the town was unsettled. Conversations stopped at the mention of Delilah's name. Shopkeepers eyed one another with thinly veiled guilt. Even the sun seemed to shine with a sharper glare. Inside the small courtroom, a crowd gathered for Brother Thomas's preliminary hearing. The benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who'd never shown up for school board meetings or Sunday services, yet thronged now to witness justice in motion. Emory and Sam sat with Delilah and the rescued girls, their faces set in quiet resolve. Judge Whitcomb, still pale from the day before, cleared his throat and called the court to order. Sam stepped forward, placing the ledger and letters carefully on the evidence table. His voice rang clear as he testified to the contents payments made with church funds, bribes disguised as donations, and the chain of command that protected Thomas from suspicion. He spoke of the darkness he'd found at the ranch, of girls living in terror rather than piety. No dramatic flourish, just steady facts laid bare. Then came Delilah's moment. Emory stood behind her as she took the stand, bruised arm exposed to the light streaming through the high windows. She inhaled, steadying herself on the railing, and began to speak not with the tremor of a frightened child, but with the calm accuracy of someone reclaiming her story. She told of the endless drills at dawn, the locks on the doors, the hidden rooms where fear was bred and bodies broken. Her voice never wavered. A hush enveloped the courtroom. Merchants shifted uncomfortably. Neighbors averted their eyes, and Judge Whitcomb rubbed his temples as though trying to massage away the truth. He summoned a clerk to record every word. Each syllable echoed through the room, unraveling years of silence and half-truths. When Delilah finished, Emory rose for the first time that decade and addressed the judge directly. His voice, low and graveled, carried the weight of unspoken grief and unwavering protection. He spoke of Sarah's memory, of his promise to stand for the defenseless, and of the cost of turning a blind eye. "Honesty has a price," he said, "and I intend to see it paid." The judge banged his gavel, and the courtroom exhaled in a collective shudder. No cheers arose, only the quiet acknowledgement that justice had been coaxed from the shadows at a cruel cost. As the bailiff led Thomas away in shackles, the rescued girls embraced Delilah, their tears relieved and raw. On the courthouse steps, Emory lifted Delilah's hand. The townspeople spilled onto the street, some offering tentative nods, others letting their gaze linger in softened regret. There was no celebration, only the fragile stirrings of a town learning that truth, once unearthed, shapes a new world in its wake. Delilah squeezed her father's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Emory tipped his hat to the crowd, then turned to lead her back to the ranch. Behind them, the courthouse doors closed on one chapter of suffering and, opened onto the uncertain promise that justice, once claimed, would never slip so easily back into darkness. The morning after the hearing, dawn crept over the ridge in ribbons of muted gold, casting long shadows across Gable's ranch. Emory stood at the gate, hands clasped behind his back, watching Delilah step barefoot into the garden plot beside the house. She carried a small tin bucket of seedson flower seedses, radiant as hope itself. She knelt in the soft earth, the bruise on her arm faded to a pale memory, and pressed each seed into the soil with gentle insistence. Emory felt the weight of what had passed, and the fragile promise of what might grow. He remembered the fire that stole Sarah and their son, the way the land around the burned homestead refused to flower for years. He wondered if this patch of dirt, tended with care and fierce intention, might bloom where sorrow once reigned. Delilah rose, palms smeared with earth, and brushed dust from her dress. She looked at the row of planted seeds, as if they were a line of small sentinels, guarding the future. "They'll need sun," she said, voice soft but steady. "And water. And time." Emory nodded, swallowing something thick and unexpected, a smile. It felt foreign, as though it belonged to another man, but it reached his eyes and lifted the tension in his shoulders. "We'll keep them safe," he promised. "Just like you." They worked side by side for hours, Emory tending the rows between Delilah's plants, until the sun stood high and the world glowed with midday heat. He fetched water from the trough, and together they dampened the earth, watching the droplets beat around each seed. Around them, the ranch stirred to life, the cattle lowed, horses nickered, and the wind riffled through the tall grass beyond the fence. At noon, they sat on the porch steps, shaded by the eaves, drinking sweetened coffee and watching the land that had been both refuge and battleground. Delilah traced the rim of her cup, then lifted her gaze to the horizon where the hills met sky. "I feel right here," she said, tapping her chest. "Like I belong again." Emory's heart clenched with relief and reverence. He thought of the darkness she had escaped, and the scars she carried, scars both visible and buried deep in memory. He reached across and squeezed her hand. "You do," he agreed. "We both do." Behind them, the barn stood solid against the blue sky, and Scout and the other horses grazed in the pasture, untroubled by past threats. The leather of Emory's old saddle gleamed in the sunlight, proof that some tools, like some hearts, could be renewed. As twilight approached, Delilah padded back to the garden. Emory followed, lifting her hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. They stood together in the fading light, the rows of planted seeds like silent witnesses to their vow. When the first star appeared, Delilah whispered, "Good night, seeds." Emory smiled, again gentle and real. "Good night," he echoed. And in the hush of the frontier evening, the ranch stood witness to their hard-won peace, the land cradling new roots born from ashes, and a father and daughter bound by promise, resilience, and an unspoken pact never to let darkness win again.